The B-29 Superfortress remains an icon of America's World War II victory in the Pacific, during which a total of 485 B-29s were lost in action, resulting in more than 5,000 casualties. The B-29 is emblematic of the deep commitment and resolve of the greatest generation, the brave men and women who fought the deadliest war in human history in the name of democracy and freedom. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress is a 4-engine, propeller-driven heavy bomber flown primarily by the United States. The B-29 was also deployed during the Korean War. One of the largest and most advanced aircraft of its time, the B-29's features included a pressurized cabin, dual-wheel tricycle landing gears, and remote electronic-controlled machine gun turrets. Designed for a high-altitude strategic bomber role, the B-29 also excelled in low-altitude nighttime incendiary bombing missions. Among the B-29's final roles during World War II were the atomic bomb attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
We are the only congressionally chartered museum in the nuclear field. We're a Smithsonian-affiliated, nationally accredited museum, and we are a place that people come to learn, to think, to imagine, and to draw their own conclusions. As an educational institution, we do talk about science, we talk about history. We are America's resource for nuclear science and history. Being in New Mexico, whereas New Mexico really was the birthplace of the atomic era, it's very important that we have such an iconic piece of history, such as the B-29 Superfortress, at our museum.
We're about all things nuclear, civilian or military. So we collect aircraft and missiles that had a nuclear mission to it, and this B-29 did have one.
The B-29 Superfortress here at the National Museum of Nuclear Science and History was manufactured in 1945 with a serial number 45-21748.
It's a great teaching tool. It's great for teaching kids and students and adults about World War II. It's a monument to the veterans who served on these planes. It just stands as a symbol for their service. It is a very important plane in New Mexico's history, which makes it very important that we want to keep it in New Mexico because it served with the 509th here. And I just love the fact that this plane was saved. Otherwise, it would have just deteriorated and disappeared. Thousands of school kids from all over the state can come and see it and talk about American history using that as a jump-off. People come from all over the country just to see that B-29. So it means a lot to the museum. It helps our programs. It brings in more revenue, which helps us put money into the education program. It helps us put money into restoring other artifacts.
We're the only destination in New Mexico where people can actually walk up to our aircraft. When they see a piece of history such as the B-29, especially with the propellers, with the size of this behemoth aircraft, it really is one of the first places that all of our visitors just walk right up to in awe.
Next to the airplane, we have installed several objects of also important historical connection to that timeline and story. There is a Fat Man casing and the packing crate that Fat Man was shipped in next to the airplane so that people can understand the scope and scale of the bombs that were being used at that time. Remember, this is the very first and second atomic bombs, the only ones used in war in our history. And so we've located one right next to our B-29 so that it is characterized there.
Today we talk about building a few hundred F-22s, and to think that we built almost 4,000 B-29s is tremendous. But yet out of those thousands, I think there's only one that's flyable, and there are only a couple that are in museums, and we've got one of them. You know, that makes this museum very unique and very special the fact that people can come here and see a restored B-29.
This is the heaviest lift aircraft that was in existence on the planet at the time of the end of World War II. It's just so emblematic, the valiant effort that the United States put forward to end World War II. This airplane was used in both Europe and Africa, as well as in the Pacific. Having one here to help showcase the efforts at Los Alamos and the national laboratories and the work that was done is really important.
This B-29 came out of the Kansas Boeing plant August 9th, 1945, and that was the day that Nagasaki was bombed. Our aircraft never went to the Pacific. It went directly to Roswell, New Mexico, because after the war, the 509th was transferred to Roswell and became part of the 8th Air Force. And at that time, this is talking about 1946, it was the only nuclear-capable unit in the world. When the Korean War started, it was selected to participate in a project called Tarzan. They took surplus British tallboy bombs, which are huge bombs, and they put radio equipment on it so the bombardier can sit in a plane and with a toggle stick can aim that bomb to where it wants to go.
Released from an undisclosed altitude, here's the target and a bullseye.
The Tarzan program didn't last very long. It had some problems. It could only be operated when the weather was good. Now, we don't know if our plane went with them. We have no record of it. Actually, it's kind of a black hole because it was probably a restricted subject. During the Korean War, they painted some of the bottom sides of the B-29s black so it would be camouflage at night. Our plane may have stayed in Eglin. It was redesignated as an experimental plane at the time. And after the Korean War, the plane was taken out of service and it was sent to Chanute Air Force Base. They took the plane and put it on static display. It painted it up to look like the Enola Gay and left it there as you go into the air base. And then eventually it was discharged from the Air Force and taken off the books. In the early 90s, it was eventually dropped from the records and it was switched to the Air Force Heritage Program. And it became available to museums if they qualified. And in 93, we were allowed to have it. It was brought to Albuquerque in many flatbed trucks, reassembled. And it's just kind of serendipity that the plane had a very good connection with New Mexico. And we decided when we were going to restore it and repaint it that we were going to use the point in time of when it was at Roswell because it has more relations to the state that we're in, and it also fits the nuclear mission of the plane. And it's the 509th, and it's the 8th Air Force. We had to do a lot of research on that. I had to get with the records department at the National Museum of the United States Air Force, because after all, it's their airplane, and I would have to come up with a plan of how we were going to do it and how the markings were going to be, submit that to the Air Force Museum, and then they had to approve it. And then we got the Air Force Historical Records Agency, which is at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, involved in it, and we finally came up with what the scheme should be, and we couldn't find a photograph of this airplane that showed those markings. Could not find one anywhere. So we just went by what it should have been at that time and how it was going to look. And that's how we painted it, fingers crossed, knocking on wood. And what was great is later on we did find a picture. One of our volunteers found it, and it shows the fuselage of the airplane at a distance behind another plane, and the numbers were right on. It was not unusual during the early Cold War. The Air Force would change up those numbers in order to throw them off, which made it really hard for people like me who were trying to research these planes because they would have these fake numbers on them and completely throw you off for like a year until you figure out that the base commander or somebody had them change it. That buzz number is part of the radio control number, which is part of the serial number. Part of that number's on the tail, and part of it's on the front. Now, it has 2 letters, BF, in front of it. BF was the Air Force designation for a B-29. We have interns from the history department at UNM that just were fabulous, and they really helped us pinpoint details about this aircraft that we would not have known otherwise. They looked at aircraft maintenance cards which are very tedious, and you have to use a book to decipher them. It's like a secret code. So we owe a lot to those kids that did that.
B-29 pilots described flight after takeoff as being a critical struggle for airspeed. The huge radial engines needed airflow to keep them cool. Failure to get up to speed as soon as possible could result in engine failure and risk of fire. Of the thousands of B-29s originally manufactured, only 17 remain intact, including the museum's restored B-29, which today stands as a proud monument to a crucial time and place in American military history.
The museum, even before my time, put out its hand to try and get a hold of a B-29. We were allowed to bring that one. It came on 7 tractor trailers and was installed when the museum was on the Air Force Base many years ago. When we moved over to our new facility, it needed to be repainted. It was in poor condition. The National Museum of Nuclear Science and History is not an aircraft museum, and it's also not a military museum. But these airplanes that we have on display are truly important to the storyline for nuclear science and history. Without an example of a B-29, it's hard to imagine what work was going on to develop the atomic bomb and deliver it to end the war in Japan. So it is an important part of our story. It is the only prop plane we do own.
People's faces light up every time they come out to Heritage Park and see the airplanes. It's just important that we can have these airplanes, especially the B-29, because it's so rare to have a B-29 on static display. And it's amazing that we can teach the history of the world and our country and what we did to win World War II.
I'm very proud of the Greatest Generation. My father wanted to be a pilot before World War II. He applied in both the Air Corps and the Navy, and his eyes weren't good enough. So he wound up eventually going into the Army in the Intelligence Corps. In November of 1944, just before the Battle of the Bulge, when the American Army was pushing through Belgium, he was out in his Jeep with his partner along the front lines. They saw an American B-17 slowly approaching from the east, obviously in trouble at low altitude. Unfortunately, it landed short of the American lines. So he looked at his partner and he said, let's go get him before the Germans get to him. And he raced over there, turned the engine off, and yelled out in English that he was an American soldier and looking for the crew. And they immediately popped up. They were in some bushes nearby. The crew wanted to thank him in some way, so they had this escape and evasion map. It's a silk map that has a map of Europe showing sort of where the lines are and where they could go. And they all signed it with their rank and their name, and they said they were all safe on November 21st, 1944. That's just my impression of the Greatest Generation. Had he been captured by the Germans, it would have been a terrible time for him, much different than a typical GI because he was in the Intelligence Corps.
My neighbor, Robert Leeds, he was aboard the USS Kearsarge during World War II in 1945, ready to storm Japan before the atomic bomb was dropped. And the atomic bomb is probably one of the reasons he's still with us today, and one of the reasons that many of the brave people that served our country during World War II are still with us.
The Greatest Generation accomplished so much. For example, the whole Manhattan Project, from the time we started work at Los Alamos until we dropped the bomb, was 28 months. So everything was designed, staffed, built, tested, and dropped in a 28-month period. And it took a generation of great people to do that.
While most bomber pilots were men, the fact is the Army Air Corps had a team of women pilots. They were known as the Women Air Force Service Pilots, also known as WASP. They flew over 60 million miles in every type of military aircraft, including the B-29 Super Fortress. All WASP records were classified and sealed for 30 years. Therefore, the bravery and skill of these women were not accessible to historians until 1975.
It was an interesting fact to learn that so many women were actually involved with the B-29 as pilots during such a impressive part of history. The women air service pilots that came in and flew this behemoth aircraft. And that did just go to show that during World War II, America really looked towards everyone. This was the greatest generation. This was men and women answering the call to serve their country.
Paul Tibbets was down at Alamogordo. They were having difficulty getting volunteers to fly the B-29, especially out in Clovis at Cannon Air Force Base. They did not want to fly the B-29 because of its very poor maintenance and problems with the engine fires. Tibbets had seen a B-26 land up in Colorado, and two women were flying it. B-26 is a very difficult plane to fly, but these two women came in and landed it, and he was amazed when he saw a woman in the cockpit. So Tibbets got the idea that if he could train them in the B-29, then he could use that to shame the recruits in Clovis. So he trained Dora Dougherty and then Dee Dee to fly the B-29. They learned how to fly it in 4 days. So he used them then to actually train the recruits at Clovis. Dora then became Tibbets's pilot on the C-54 transport aircrafts around the country, flying out of Kirtland. He liked them because they went there and they came back.
The B-29 is an amazing engineering feat. Of course, it was pressurized, could fly at high altitude, could fly very fast. Basically, it flew so high and so fast that the Japanese fighters had difficulty making it up that high. And if they could, they couldn't close on it. They couldn't fly as fast as it could at that altitude. So it was an amazing airplane. To give you some idea of what an engineering marvel the B-29 is, work on the B-29 actually started in about 1938. Boeing first started thinking about a pressurized, large, four-engine bomber bigger than the Flying Fortress in about 1938. It really didn't start being used operationally until about 1944. We started on the bomb later than we did on the B-29, and they were finished about the same time. From that standpoint, you could argue that building the B-29 was a more significant engineering feat than building the atomic bomb. It was copied by the Russians. You know, several had engine problems and wound up landing in Russia. It was used by the British. It was converted into transport, into a tanker. So the basic design was a solid design that was used in a lot of different ways. It influenced the design of airplanes to come. I mean, if you think about it, with the exception of swept wings and jet engines, the B-29 had almost all the characteristics of our advanced airplanes today. When you look at a B-29, you're really looking at one of the first of the really modern airplanes. Essentially, in combination with the atomic bomb, the B-29 ended the war. Wars are horrible things. The result of the B-29 in World War II is that the war with Japan ended sooner, and I think far fewer lives were lost. The B-29 took a lot of lives in that process, but I think had it not been around, we would have found that the war would have gone on much longer, and many more people would have died. It's a horrible war. So I think it had a tremendous impact on history, and a lot of people got to come home, or in the case in Japan, got to raise their families, go on with their lives, and get back to a peaceful world.
The National Museum's B-29 has been carefully restored and is on display today as it was during its mission with the 8th Air Force 509th Bombardment Group in Roswell, New Mexico, just after the end of World War II. All insignia and surfaces are displayed in accordance with Strategic Air Command issued guidelines and approvals.
Our aircraft is the most photographed artifact at the museum. And because of that, we knew that there would be a following that really would be interested in the restoration of our B-29. Since we are one of only 17 left in existence, such an iconic piece of history was so important. It was my job to get the word out to the masses.
We had over 50 volunteers from places like Colorado, Los Alamos Labs, Sandia Labs, the Air Force, the Air National Guard. We had volunteers from everywhere you could think of. We did have a wonderful paint job. We contracted that completely out, didn't do that by volunteer, and the aircraft looks as good as it did in 1945 when it came out of the assembly line.
This project has really helped me learn about our history. It's gotten me a lot more interested in airplanes. It's brought so many people together that would have never met each other before. It's really helped me meet some amazing people, some veterans, and just some people just around New Mexico that are just helping. And they've all come together just to work on this airplane. And it's helped bring together family members that have been apart for many years. And it's helped me get closer to my dad. And it's an amazing project, an amazing experience.
The Fat Man nuclear weapon, we wanted to put that next to the B-29 as an artifact. And that weapon, restoring it and its shipping crate, turned out to be one of the biggest efforts we had in the restoration. It took so much time. The volunteers who did that were mostly Sandia Labs and the Air National Guard of New Mexico. Inside that shipping crate, which is now sealed up, they put a time capsule in there of all their photographs, the newspaper articles, and everything they were doing, and they've got a wonderful time capsule in there if someone ever opens it up.
We started a Kickstarter project the spring of 2014 with the goal to raise $44,000. One of the biggest things that we were trying to do with the B-29 is we decided that we were going to light it up and make the lights on the B-29 work.
Associate Director of Los Alamos was a naval captain, Captain Deke Parsons. He had the responsibility of converting the physics, chemistry, and metallurgy of the bomb into a bomb that could be delivered. So they evaluated all the aircraft at the time for their capabilities. The B-17 and the B-24, which were our heavy bombers in Europe at that time, did not have the range. They only had about a 1,700-mile range. They didn't have load carrying capacity. The closest we could get to Japan was about 1,500 miles, and that was on the island of Tinian next to Saipan. So they had to try to find an aircraft that would do that. There were two possibilities. One was the British Lancaster. It was a proven bomber in Europe. It had load carrying capacity, and it also had range. The other possibility was the B-29. The problem with the B-29, it was only paper. They had no units. Dr. Ramsey then recommended the British Lancaster to General Hap Arnold, who was Chief of Staff of the Air Force. He used words like he'd go to hell before he would allow the first atomic bomb to be dropped by a British bomber.
When Germany conquered France and Britain was on their own, we didn't know if Britain was going to hold out. So the Army put out a request for a bomber that can fly from the United States and bomb Germany. That's where the genesis of the B-29 came from.
The B-29 went into production without a test program. The test pilot of Boeing had just crashed the first B-29 to come off the production line in Seattle, killing the crew and 19 people on the ground. Paul Tibbets, who will eventually become commander of the 509th Composite Group, had just completed his tour of duty in Europe. He'd completed 25 missions. He came back and he was assigned to debug the B-29. Probably one of the big reasons he was selected to command the 509th Composite Group. The Little Boy and Fat Man weighed about 10,000 pounds. They wanted to drop them from over 30,000 feet altitude. That's because the Japanese anti-aircraft guns could only reach up to 30,000 feet. Also, the Zero fighter couldn't operate above 30,000. They streamlined the B-29s by taking off all the gun turrets. That saved about 7,000 pounds of load. One bomb was just about the load capacity then, because they also had 7,000 gallons of fuel on board. When Tibbets took off in the Enola Gay, he was 15,000 pounds overweight, and he used every yard of the 8,500-foot long runway in Tinian. In fact, Farabee, the bombardier sitting in the nose, was really concerned because he looked right down and there's the water that he could almost put his feet in. B-29 was very unreliable. It had engine problems. The engines didn't get enough air. They overheated. To lighten the aircraft, they had used magnesium in the engines. And when that magnesium caught fire in an engine fire, it would burn the wings off. So we lost more B-29s in mechanical failure than we did in hostile action. Initially, the Air Force's interface with the Manhattan Project was classified. You could not have any communication goes out that had those two organizations in the same communication. The Silver Plate, which is the actual name, code name given to the modifications, modified about 65 of the aircraft for the overall mission. The B-29 was tested at Alamogordo, New Mexico, to determine the vulnerability of the B-29 to the Zero fighter. Tibbets's plane that he'd been flying, which had armament on it, was in for maintenance. So the only plane that was available was a stripped-down B-29. Had all the armaments off, and so it was lighter. And as soon as Tibbets took off in it, he realized the rate of climb, the maneuverability, the ceiling, the speed, and that light B-29 could outturn P-47, and he could also outrun it. And so he had that in his mind then for the actual Silver Plate models.
After 1948, the program became known as Saddle Tree. And Saddle Tree included more different kinds of aircraft and still included B-29s. This plane was on a secret mission in Korea, and it actually crashed, and it was doing some sort of UFO type thing. And then there was another plane with a similar number. Well, the plane they're talking about, I found it. It's on exhibit in Korea at an air base. Many years ago, and they had a reunion of the Enola Gay crew, and they had a reunion of the Duke of Albuquerque crew. And the museum thought it'd be really cute to put the insignia from the Duke of Albuquerque on this B-29. So they made it out of vinyl and they put it on there. You know, a lot of pictures were taken with the crew in front of it. And so for a lot of people, that plane is the Duke of Albuquerque. I think the Duke of Albuquerque was taken out of service and was destroyed. The Duke of Albuquerque was a B-29 that was assigned to the Pacific, different crew, different serial number. And that's in the Air Force records. And even some people to this day, they'll say, well, that plane's really the Duke of Albuquerque. You know that, don't you? No, it's not. There was another plane called the Mission to Albuquerque. Now, that did go down during the Pacific War. And as far as I know, those are only two planes that had the word Albuquerque in it, but they sometimes get mixed up with this plane. This one out here is the correct number on that plane because we have a picture and we went in and looked at the radio control number. It's also known as a serial number, and it's a plate that Boeing puts in it. That is the correct nomenclature for that aircraft.
One of the most colorful and completely untrue stories about the airplane is that the BF-748 was used to carry alien bodies and material from the Roswell incident to the ultra-secret Manzano base at Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Also untrue is the myth that the plane was later sent to the Pacific on a mission over the China Sea, where, the myth goes, it exploded, losing the crew and aircraft. The story claimed that the crew knew too much about the Roswell aliens. And if you know anything about this event, and you discuss it, the Men in Black will pay you a visit.